Okay, grade 10s. Today we are going to move on with our ecosystem notes. Because of the circumstance and me trying to reduce a little bit of workload on you, I'm going to actually ask you to just skip over a certain part in your notes right now. So in the last lesson, we finished off discussing, we were at what, I'm just trying to figure out what page we were at right now. So we were talking about populations and sustainability, and we finished off by talking about carrying capacity. And then, so the last slide that we looked at was with the pellet group counting. Now, what I want you to do is actually skip the next part where it discusses niches, ecological niches. We're going to glaze over that part right now, and we're actually going to move on to cycles, which is halfway down your page 14 in your notebooklet. We're going to get into cycles today. If you want to go back and copy those notes down, you can do that on your own time, but just know that I'm going to be skipping over that. So when it comes to assessments and assignments and stuff, I will not be expecting you to have that info. So let's move on then to cycles. Here we go. And let's get started. So cycles. We've got 4 different types there. We're not going to talk about hydrologic cycles. We're going to talk about carbon cycles. We're going to talk about oxygen cycles, and we're going to talk about nitrogen cycles. We'll try to keep this as brief and as prompt as possible because I know not everybody wants to listen to a lengthy video. I want to be able to keep your attention. So nature is the best recycler because it's constantly reusing different nutrients by cycling them through different parts of the environment. Now, how does it do that? It does that through nutrient cycles. All 3 of the elements that we're going to be looking at in terms of nutrient cycles, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, are very important nutrients in our environment. They contribute to all the life and the growth. Without these 3 things, there would be no life. So all 3 of these elements cycle through in their own environment cycle. Let's discuss the first one, the carbon cycle. Carbon composes some part of every single living thing around us, including yourselves. And how carbon cycles through our atmosphere, or sorry, through our environment, is it moves from the air into a plant, from that plant into an animal, from that animal back into the air or down into the ground. But wait, there's a few more steps we can look at. So here's a nice little visualization of our carbon cycle. You've got carbon dioxide. That's how it exists in its gas state in the atmosphere. And you can see that it returns to the atmosphere via respiration from animals or from the soil or from the water by evaporation, okay? Or it can even return via this from these plants as well. Now, the way that it returns back into the soil is through photosynthesis. So the plants will take it. Sorry, it'll be absorbed by the plants. The plants will take it. Remember, we've learned this for a while now. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide and then give us oxygen. So the plants respire, they take it in, and then it either, when the plants or the animals die, returns back to the soil, and it gets into the animals via us eating the plants. And then it will turn to the soil. Now, when it's in the soil, if it's there for a really, 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 really long time under all of the immense pressure of all the soil on top of it, it compresses it, pressurizes it, and turns it into something we call fossil fuels. These are what we use to run our factories. So what you see here is everything besides this one, everything outside, on the outside here, is completely natural. Would just, it's been occurring forever, right? As long as the earth has been around. But right here with our factories and our excess combustion of carbon, we're adding more carbon into the atmosphere. So that's the unnatural part of this cycle, is our factories that we've now started using, burning up carbon and returning it to the atmosphere. This right here is a very, very important diagram. So you need to, when I tell you that it's important, I want you to try to remember this one, okay? So fill this in. You've got atmospheric carbon dioxide at the top, that's in the air. Plants use carbon dioxide to make their food, that's called photosynthesis. Green plants are eaten by the animals, so that's how we get the carbon from them. And then animals and plants all die eventually, and the remains of those animals and plants will return back to the soil via decay, so decompose fungi and bacteria. And then either the animals will breathe it out, or the plants will breathe it out, or the soil will breathe it back out via respiration back into the atmosphere. So that is the carbon cycle. You can pause now if I went too fast, and you can copy that down. But if not, let's move on. The oxygen cycle. The oxygen cycle is very closely related to the carbon cycle. Okay, there's photosynthesis, creates oxygen and adds it to the air. And then respiration and bodily functions turn that oxygen back into carbon dioxide. That's respiration inside of living things. Almost all living things require oxygen for life. We can basically say all living things require oxygen for life. There's some bacteria that don't, but having almost all living things require it means that it's kind of important. How does it work? Oxygen moves between the atmosphere, so the biosphere, which is where we live, that's like where there's like land and soil. And then there's the hydrosphere, which is all the water stuff. And then it also moves down into the lithosphere, that's underground. All of these are different processes. Basically, think carbon cycle, just basically it moves in the opposite direction. We take in the oxygen from the air. And then when we die, or when plants die, there is oxygen returned to the soil, and then we either breathe out carbon dioxide, or the soil returns the carbon dioxide into the air, and it goes back and restarts the whole cycle. So it makes its way carbon dioxide back into the air, and then the plants use it to make their food, and they respire oxygen to begin the whole process again. This one right here is not as important of a diagram, as well as this one right here. We're actually going to skip this slide altogether. This one just goes a little bit too in depth. We don't need it. It's not even in your notes. So let's move on. Finally, the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is another important element that is important to life on Earth. It's an essential part of our DNA and all of our proteins. So nitrogen is actually the majority of the air that we breathe. You might not have known that. Remember, why is it N2? Well, N2 is because it's a Hofbrinkel element. That's a throwback to chemistry for you there. So when it's in its gas state, in the state that we could breathe it in, we do breathe it in, it's existing as a diatomic molecule. But we can't use nitrogen as we breathe it in. We have to get it in a different form. Okay, we have to get nitrogen through eating something that has nitrogen in it. That's how we can use it. So it has to go through a cycle to become useful for our bodies, because we can't just breathe in nitrogen and use it. Otherwise, we'd all be completely huge and like unnaturally strong, or at least not comparatively to what we're used to, because that's what nitrogen does. It helps with growth. So atmospheric nitrogen, like I said, exists as N2 in the atmosphere, but we can't use it like that. But here's what happens. So this is a bit of a complicated one, so bear with me here. Okay, there's just a few really key parts that you need to know, and I'll point them out when we get to them. So it enters into the soil via nitrogen-fixing bacteria that lives within the roots of plants. So the plants will bring in that atmospheric nitrogen and bring it into the soil. Now, that nitrogen is in the soil, but it's still not usable for us. What happens is it goes through these nitrogen-fixing bacteria and turns into ammonium. Then it gets nitrified. So this whole process right here, we kind of, for our purposes, clump into one category called nitrogen-fixing bacteria, or nitrifying bacteria. It basically takes atmospheric nitrogen and turns it into nitrates and nitrites. If you take a look at the ingredients for a food that you like, you might see something like nitrates or nitrites in there. Okay, this is a consumable type of nitrogen. So then it can get its way into plants when it's nitrates, when it's in the form of nitrates and nitrites. And when it can get its way into plants, well, then we can eat it and we can actually get the nitrogen that we need. Now, the morbid part of all of these cycles is that all plants and animals do eventually die. And when they die, decomposers return that nitrogen that was within those plants and animals back to the soil. So these are the decomposers here. Now, you'll notice there's kind of a cycle within a cycle here. This can continue to happen for a really long time until eventually denitrifying bacteria returns it back to its original state. So it's no longer NO3. It separates it from the oxygen and returns it back to its nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen state, back into the atmosphere. And then it'll start the whole process again. So we're really focused on this one part right here. This is called nitrogen fixation, changing nitrogen from N2 to forms that are usable for us. So nitrogen mostly moves from the atmosphere to the ground through nitrogen fixing bacteria. Some natural events can actually do that as well. Lightning strikes, forest fires, and lava flow, those can cause nitrogen fixation just because of their immense, really high temperatures, the really high heat. But these events don't happen that frequently, right? We can't rely on our nitrogen needs, just wait for lightning strikes and forest fires and lava flow. So what humans have done, we've come up with a way to do this in the lab on our own because our population is growing. We need more fertile soil. We need plants to be growing bigger and more fruitful than ever before to be able to feed all of us. What we do is we have a fertilizer that's nitrogen based. And that can basically skip that step of needing that really high heat into just excess nitrogen for the plants to be able to consume and get bigger. Once the nitrogen has been changed to a usable form, it's taken up by different processes. So we spread that fertilizer, and then plants will use it to grow bigger. And then animals will eat those plants to process it, and then we grow bigger. Now, here's the thing, though, is nitrogen, an excess of nitrogen, it's almost, the saying, too much of a good thing. Some nitrogen is always going to end up staying in that soil, and eventually it's going to make its way out as air, but not all of it's going to make its way out of air. Some of it's actually, before it can make its way back out as air, it's going to get washed into waterways. Now, having nitrogen in water is a good thing, but having too much nitrogen in water can actually be very dangerous. So in our next lesson, first off, we're done for our notes for today. In our next lesson that we do together, I'm going to get you to watch a video on what can happen when we have too much nitrogen in water. It hits very close to home because it's happening actually in Lake Winnipeg. Before that, though, I have a short online assignment that I'm going to be posting tomorrow morning for you to work on. So tomorrow will be Thursday, and I want you to work on it Thursday and Friday and try to get it in to me by the end of Friday or by Monday, if you can. Okay, Monday at the latest, because I need to get that mark in for your report cards. So you've got an assignment coming up in ecosystems. Now the assignment's not going to be very long. It's going to be on what we talked about in our unit intro. It'll be about populations and sustainability and cycles. Okay, so it'll be in the form of a Google form, and I'll get you to submit that or to work on that tomorrow. And then we'll move on with the excess nitrogen inside of the lakes next week. Okay, so we'll talk to you later. Have a good rest of your day.